great. And most economists who are otherwise very clever, they would, is Irwin here? Shout or raise your hand. I can't see. All right. Well, isn't it true? I mean, most young economists, they'd stop there and then send the paper in to get it published, right? Right. And that's wrong. Don't you do that. What you should do is then use these results to ask, well, who cares? I mean, does it have a big impact on anything that matters? So you got to take that last step, which I'm sure Irwin would, because he's a very clever guy. So use it and start asking questions about it. But one thing it's worth stopping and talking about is that the stock of immigrants matters. The stock of immigrants resident in the US matters in influencing this year's migration flows from the country in question. That is, the stock of immigrants from Kerala in the US will influence this year's flow of immigrants coming from Kerala. And quite significantly, really big, actually. And when you do this kind of analysis for the 19th century, how important are these friends and relatives effects? And you can see what it does. For every additional 1,000 of Irish residents in the US in the 19th century, 20 more would migrate in any given year. Irishmen or women would migrate in that year. That's a big impact, as it turns out. And when you look at the evidence, as we just did, on the econometrics for the late 20th century and early 21st, it's 18 to 1,000. It's not very different from what you had in the 19th century. Same laws of motion, you know, these historic constants that are coming out. So it's very powerful on the upswing of those cycles, those life cycles we saw for each of the regions. And they're going to be important on the downside because when demography changes, education changes, economic conditions change, and those fundamentals should have an impact, say, on reducing outmigration from the Philippines, say, to the US, you won't see it for a while because it'll be offset by this friends and neighbors effect. But then that begins to die out slowly over time. Absence does not make the heart grow fonder. You know, they send less and less money, you know, and it kind of breaks down that effect. And then the underlying demography and economic forces will really, all of a sudden, woohoo, they'll be noticed. Okay, so why you have to look at the U.S. because it's the major absorber of immigrants, right? But it's a little weird. It's weird because these migration effects, these friends and relatives effects, are bigger than anywhere else, I think, bigger than anywhere else in the EU and Australia and elsewhere. And that's because of some weird thing the US legislature has in their heads. Starting with the first Quota Act in 1921, where we raised the restrictions and became racist. No Asians need apply, thank you very much. And it'll be all Europeans because we like, they got light skin and they eat our food and, they talk our languages. So don't want to mess around with Asians. And certainly not Africans, thank you very much. So it was a racist period, and it's embedded in there, but this legislation right off at the start had this family reunification component to it, and exceedingly generous. It's not after the primary male gets a job in the US, then wife can come, all the kids can come, aunts, uncles, grandparents, third cousins, It's a very broad definition of family reunification. Other countries like Britain, it's a very narrow definition. I think for Britain now, it's just spouse, kids, period. That means the multipliers are vastly bigger in the US case. In fact, only about 20% of US immigrants are touched by the quotas. These are the primary immigrants. The other 80% got a free ride. They're all family reunification types. They're not influenced by the quotas at all. Quotas are only applied to the primary worker. So for the US, these are especially big, these friends and relatives effects as a result, because the US has the most generous system. So, okay, so what are the forces doing most of the work pushing the out-migration on the upswing of this inverted U? Well, family reunification plays a role, the migrant stock effect and all that, especially powerfully for the US. Then second is the income gaps. There's much to be gained by moving to the high-wage countries like the US. So when they exploit it, big gains. That continues to be the case and gets bigger, except in Asia, which starts getting double-digit growth rates around and about the region, and they start closing the gap. Next is demography, the demographic transitions we've talked so much about. And the young adult booms were taking place when those, from the 1970s onwards, and continue to do so before they reach a peak and then begin to fall off. There was a schooling revolution in Asia and the rest of the third world, a primary schooling revolution, which raised the level of education compared to the receiving countries, the US, which made them better equipped for the jobs available in the US. That plays a role. And finally, the numbers in poverty drop in the third world early on. Where the number was 50, World Bank says the number was 50% in the 1950s and down to 25% in the 1990s. So 25% jumped over the poverty line, had more resources to invest in the move, and sent their children abroad as a result. This effect is pretty weak in Africa, which has been a basket case, you know, for many decades, but strong elsewhere, of course. Okay, so how come the boom, we have to wait for the 1970s for the boom to take place? And why doesn't it take place in 1946? Why do you have to wait until the 1970s to the migration boom to take place? Well, the income gaps were there, you know, already. So there's lots to exploit in terms of differences across borders. But the big change is the change in policy, which changes the rules of the game and which levels the policy playing field. The third world share in immigration, you know, just increased dramatically between the 50s and the 70s at the start of the big boom. And part of this was the change in our immigration laws in 1965, where we said we will not discriminate against any country. We may discriminate against all countries by imposing quotas and restrictions, but we won't be specific to any one country. So that 65 amendment, which becomes law, becomes active in, I think it's 1968, is crucial. But my argument would be that that policy change really mattered when you start getting into the 70s, would not have mattered if that legislation was passed in 1946, because the other conditions were not satisfied, these other fundamentals. So my notion is that that policy change would only have an impact after educational levels have been improved in the third world, after they've had some economic growth, which reduced the poverty rates, and so on and so forth. There's what the numbers, what these numbers look like. Between 60 and 87, I was surprised to learn this. I didn't realize this was true, but school years per person in those adult age categories rose by 0.3% per annum in the rich industrial countries, but 4% in the developing world. They're starting from a low level, of course, but you know, there's catch up, big time, in educational levels as measured by that statistic. And if you look at the ratio of years of schooling, you get the same result. The advantage of the industrial countries begins to drop. The unlocking of the poverty gaps. Here you see some numbers on. We're not talking about growth miracles. You know, these are not impressive growth rates. They're not catching up to the U.S. or anybody, but they are growing, and growing by quite a bit. So per capita income increases by half in Africa, and then in Latin America, Africa, and then their troubles began after 1970. And by 41% in East Asia, 59% in Latin America. So all three combined, you know, it increases by about half. As I say, that's not enough to have you catch up to the advanced economies, especially when Europe is undergoing a growth miracle itself. But it's enough to start releasing the poverty constraints on the out-migration. A lot. Demography, we talked about that stuff, and there are the numbers documenting how important they were here for Asia, but the other regions follow behind. Okay, so the bottom line on the 60s is the way I figure it is, had Congress passed that amendment in 1946 rather than 65, you wouldn't have had a big impact on out-migration from the third world. There's just these other factors were not yet satisfied. Only afterwards would it, and it sure did in the 70s. Okay, so what caused the downturn that we saw for these regions and the countries within them? Remember, when I started this, I said you have to think these are the general attributes. Does the Philippines violate these general rules? If so, why? Well, I want to see you tell me about that. Okay, so we're on the downside now. All the forces that push things up now weaken or drop. The demographic transition is over in Asia, and the big increase in the young adults is now easing off. They're aging, all that. Latin America follows suit. Africa's quite a bit behind, but they've done their thing with a demographic bang, and so it's on the downside. More third world countries are joining double-digit or almost double-digit growth rates, so they're beginning to catch up, reducing the advantage to moving abroad. And the steam goes out of the schooling revolution. I haven't read much about why that is so. But the schooling revolution is the catch-up on high-income nations, on education, ceases during this episode. And so the new immigrants, potential immigrants, are less equipped to make the move, as their schooling is not quite right for the receiving country.